Can you detail the difference between how we make decisions now as opposed to how decisions are arrived at in a resource-based economy?
Well, the decision-making system now is mainly based upon different industries which feel that they have a good product, so they advertise and convince people to buy that product. Whereas in the future, in a saner system, we would design products not to wear out and break down, to last as long as possible, so that the responsibility of the service sector would not be overloaded. The longer materials last, the less burdensome to society. Therefore, our major concern is not profit, it's the well-being of human beings throughout the world. To the degree that we neglect people, we hurt our own future. For example, if we in the United States controlled most of the Earth's resources, we would produce anxiety in other countries for fear of running out of resources, arable land, water, etc. And therefore they might invade this country to try to get the necessary resources for survival. I don't think it's wise for a nation to defend itself or try to make sustainability available only in the area that they live, because they would produce hatred and envy and try to control the resources of other countries so that we can enslave people or put them on minimum wage and get whatever we want produced for the self-centered reason of our nation. And we seek national advantage rather than global advantage. As long as we seek national advantage, it may work for a while. It may enhance the lifestyles or increase the productivity of goods and services. But that's not a long duration. This is the only thing I worry about. Sustainability for separate nations is okay in the short run, but in the long run it produces negative retroaction. So here's how we really work, if you want to know. I think the best way to understand it was assuming that we found a planet similar to the Earth, with lots of resources, unspoiled waters, non-contaminated air, and brought a group of people together and asked, what is it that people really need? And then you list all the things that people really need. The next question is, can that planet provide for those needs? And if it cannot, you have to base your needs on what the planet can provide. If the population is too large, the planet cannot provide for that enlarged population. Therefore, the size of the population would be built and based upon the carrying capacity of that regional division or the planet's capacity to produce sustainable materials. Therefore, we cannot invite billions of people to live on the new planet if the planet cannot sustain them. So when I say decisions have to be arrived at, first you have to study the carrying capacity of a planet, what it's capable of supporting. Then you design your cities and population densities so that they correspond to the carrying capacity of the environment. That's what I mean when I say people do not make decisions, they arrive at them. And how do you decide how much oxygen to carry on a submarine? Well, it depends on the amount of people in a submarine and how long you wish to be submerged. And that determines that. How do you know how much water to carry on a submarine? How do you know how much food to carry? How do you know how much electrical power? Depends on the performance you want of that submarine. Then you put in the proper electrical power for operating the submarine. You have to put in enough food and refrigeration equipment to feed the crew. If you don't provide for that, the technology may work, but the crew won't. So you have to not make decisions, you have to arrive at them. For example, if you had an ocean liner and you took 5,000 people on a world cruise, before you even start out, you have to have these people register for the trip. Otherwise, you can't make your decision. Once you get 5,000 people that registered for that trip and they were paid in advance in a monetary system, you know how much food, how much water you need to take care of showers and baths and dishwashing. All those things have to be studied so that you can build an estimate of what it would take to operate that ship. If you just have a lot of people sitting around with a great deal of experience that can estimate what a ship needs, that can be done also. But I would say statistical mechanics is really the best way to go at it. Do a fresh survey of conditions. Now, after you finish that survey, you must also do a corresponding survey as the weather in the direction you're headed. If you're headed for a 6,000-mile trip and you know the weather conditions and the wind conditions, you can better estimate the needs of that ship. But if you just figure out the people and the food and the water, that's part of the problem. The other part is the weather. Storms at sea can delay the trip, require more resources than you anticipated, and more fuel than you anticipated. So what is really needed? The more comprehensive a survey, the closer you will have to making a successful voyage. Now, when I was a kid, the airlines had a different setup. They used to weigh people, and if they weighed 400 pounds, they had to pay more, because the airplane consumed more fuel to stay aloft. Now, that was one system, but they averaged that out and found out that it didn't bring as many customers. So what they did is averaged out the cost and built some sort of statistical data to tell how many people. Now, if you have a different compartment in the airplane where you have first-class passengers and they require different kinds of food than the average passenger, you have to take all that into consideration. Now, if your airplane is so old and you feel maybe you can get 10 more flights out of it, that's in the profit system. But in the non-profit system, we run airplanes and render them non-serviceable after so many hours of service, because that would benefit and move people safely from one point to another. But if you work in a profit system, you try to get as much as you can out of that airplane. And you might produce fatigue of the metals running it for profit. But running it for public service is no loss to any individual or corporation. So I say that decision making in the resource-based economy is just that. It's based on what resources do we have. And that, in turn, determines the decision-making process. No one sits around and says, I think we'll pack 700 people into an airplane designed to carry 400. It won't get off the ground. And knowing that, having that experience, most passenger systems are based upon the carrying capacity, the wing load, the profit for transporting people from point A to point B. All those things have to be ascertained before you can even set a fee. Then you have to set a fee that will support the landing fees, the carrying capacity of the service element in the airplane, the flight service elements, the salaries of the pilots, the navigator, the people that deliver food and prepare food. All that has to be taken into account. And if you don't take that into account, the flight will not be successful. And if you wish to put an airplane through particular maneuvers, first you have to have a stress report on what the wings of that plane can stand. If you don't have a stress report, you might overload the airplane. I know of many instances when I was younger, when people tried to fly from New York to Paris, they would overload the plane with gasoline to assure, this was what they wanted, to assure that they have enough fuel even if they had a headwind. But they couldn't get off the ground. The plane kept going up and dropping back at the ground. It was too heavy to get off the ground. And then it crashed into the fence and burst into flames. That's why the new law of the Federal Aviation Institute said you can only carry so much fuel. Where do you get laws from? Survey. If things don't work, then you have a problem. And they found out that the Coriolis effect, meaning the rotation of the Earth, caused trains moving in the longitudinal direction for one track to wear out sooner than the other, because the rotation of the Earth made the train right heavy or left heavy, depending on what part of the world you were in. So what they did is they tilted the tracks so they'd wear evenly. How do you determine how much degree of tilt? By the amount of wear. That's what I mean by no one making decisions. Arriving at decisions is, what have we here? Answer, I don't know. Let's find out. Then you find out about the Coriolis effect. You find out about the freight you're carrying. And the freight you carry might be fruit or vegetables. And the weight of the train is so much that the train itself consumes a lot of energy using a railway train for transportation. So you have to ask, what means exist today to move freight that's relatively lightweight without a heavy unit moving the freight? You won't use a war tank to plow the fields because it will damage the soil, it's too heavy. So you design a tractor that's lightweight. Some army men felt that, gee, when we're not at war, we should use war tanks for construction purposes. They're really too heavy and consume too much fuel. But if you design a tank to do a specific job, you want it to weigh as much as necessary to do the job you want done. That's what survey means. You can make a war tank and you can use it to plow the fields, but your cost would be enormous. And therefore, anyone that makes that kind of decision would be operating at a loss. Anyone who tries to manufacture products by putting in installations that cost more to manufacture the product than the product sells for, that's how you decide not to use that. So a survey means a global survey of all the resources needed today. If you build cities and they all look different, and every city blueprint is different, that means more architects are involved in the design of the cities. And as the cities grow in population, you have to work under the ground, make more tunnels for transportation, waste disposal. But if you design a system of human congregation and living, and that system provides for industries that are in close approximation of the living community without the noise of industry, we have to then arrive at ways of suppressing noise without the view of ugly industries, smoking industrial plants, plants with precipitators on top of the smokestack. So all particulate matter is condensed, and the only thing coming out of smokestacks would be warm air, and that would be used in drying machines. So we just don't pump warm air into the atmosphere. We have economy engineers work on what to do with surplus heat or surplus cool. In other words, in Canada, you have permafrost under the ground, and they put pipes deep down, only 10 feet. They run pipes up and back for half a mile, and then they take that cool air in the pipe and cool all the buildings in the summertime. And in the wintertime, they use all heat, which is gathered from industry and piped into the city. In the summertime, you can take pipes and run it under the roadways if they're dark, and they accumulate a great deal of heat. So many highways and parking lots can be used to heat cities or cool cities. We don't do that. In the private sector, each little industry looks after itself. If you have a home, and each home has a kitchen, and in all the kitchens we have cooks, the wife, the family, that prepare food for breakfast, lunch, and supper. It is more efficient to design dining areas where you purchase food in large quantities instead of each person going to the market and coming back with a bag of food, putting it in the refrigerator. If you are part of the agricultural system, the food is delivered in large quantities, so not everybody is making bacon and eggs. And if you do that, you can conserve enormous energy and time, so people have more time to do more appropriate things that would render their lives easier and better. So a stove in every home, a refrigerator in every home might be pleasant, but it's a waste of energy and a waste of time of people going shopping, stocking the refrigerator. Oh, I forgot to get lemonade. Whereas a massive food approach of restaurants and dining areas are really far more efficient. It started that way. In the early days, in a small community, everyone would cook. And then woman was a very fast cook. She could cook faster, and she could provide you with breakfast cheaper than you can buy it, because she ordered lots of material. But that isn't the case today. Restaurants charge quite a bit more. But if you buy food in quantity, you can sell it for less. Dining. If you cook in large vats, you can charge much less than every house burning food or cooking oatmeal or any other thing. Bacon and eggs consumes more energy. This is how we decide that there'll be restaurants rather than individual cooking. If a person, but what if I wanted individual cooking? Well, you can go to cook school and learn to cook for the community if you liked it. But you could also design the buildings so that they can have that kind of service. If they had that kind of service, you won't be able to take care of everybody well. So the extent is, what is it that you want? You want a world without hunger, poverty, war, prisons, police, then you have to manage your resources. If every building has different kinds of windows, that's going to cost much more. But if you design the optimal window for the conditions that that building is in, and then manufacture thousands and thousands of windows, all of the same basic design, you can turn out more cities at a much lower cost. But if you want a different building on every corner, your cost will be enormous. Building A consumes so much energy. Right next door you got building B that consumes 1/3 that amount of energy. So your feeder lines into the building become abnormally inefficient or expensive. So all decision making is based upon the carrying capacity of the environment. We don't build industrial plants miles away from the sources of energy or the metals to be manufactured. Industrial plants are built near the resources, and cities are built near the working people live in or near the cities they work in. They don't have to drive an hour to work. Of course, driving an hour to work is good in a monetary system. You have to buy more fuel, but it's inefficient. If industry owned a great deal of the community, including the housing, the restaurants, they used to have the company store in the old days. Did you know that? And the company store and company housing. So the working people could live near the plant. They didn't have to get a horse and buggy to get to the plant. So the plant owners did do that. They had rental units that were low cost, and they managed that those rental units, they deducted that from the salary. And of course the salaries were lower in the old days. And so they had to make a profit. And the usual markup was 5 times the production cost. Now, you can move it up 6 times. It depends on what you want. If people are working, they'll buy it. If they're not working, if you move your price too high, you'll go out of business. So if you don't do a survey, which they do today, they find out, does the average person save money or spend it? Well, the average person's savings are going down. The average person does not have it. If industry had its way, it would design uniforms and clothing for people, but it's not going to make a different suit for everybody working in the place. It'll make the same kind of uniform. It's easier to do it that way. When you have an army and each soldier were to buy his own clothing of a slightly different design, you wouldn't know who to shoot at or who not to shoot at. So when you design uniform clothing, you are working in a massive way to operate at a lower cost. Not only do you want to feed people and house people for your own industry, you want their clothing. And you want them to buy toothpaste in your drugstore, because you can open a drugstore and you can operate a greater profit. If you have 2,000 people living near your plant, you can open a grocery store or a restaurant. That would be efficiency all the way for the free enterprise system. And in the old days they did that to a limited extent. Today, with unions and salaries going up, when the salary of a union worker goes up, the cost of the car goes up, and the plant loses a competitive edge. That's why industry hates unions, because they make it difficult to predict earning capacity. Anytime the union goes out on strike, your earning capacity drops. When your earning capacity drops, the investors invest less in your company. So they do a survey, not for the benefit of humanity, for the benefit of the corporation. So in a resource-based economy, the more we hurt people, the greater the expenditure of energy. The less health care we give people, the more absenteeism. So we try to keep everyone healthy, and we try to use the fastest and cleanest machinery and the cleanest atmosphere, just as industry does. When industry orders lubrication oil, they buy the best lubrication oil for their machines. They buy the best filters that filter the oil and run it back through the machines. But they don't care whether you eat hamburgers or frankfurters or salami sandwiches, which may kill you. That isn't their problem, that's your problem. But in a socially integrated society, even the food you eat will be monitored. Do you understand that? So the people can obtain optimal health. And the people that prepare food would have to be good at it. They'd have to make the food tasty and desirable. That's also part of the plan. So you just don't cook nothing but oatmeal with raisins in it. You can do that and feed everybody. But people will quit and go to work elsewhere if they get a wider variety. So you have to prepare food that people like. That's part of the survey. So the survey means to do a study of the environment. If your study is incorrect, it will fail. If the study meets those services based upon surveys, it'll work. And so, if we have a catastrophe that hits the earth, say a meteor hits the earth in a planned society, you'd have to have contingency plans that can take care of major things like that, like the tsunami in Japan, the earthquake in Japan, the windstorms. All of that was just too much for any one nation to be able to support. So there has to be an international distribution center where the international communities produce a surplus and move that surplus to the distribution centers. In case of a national emergency, they don't have to appeal to decency and ethics to feed the poor, hungry Japanese or the Chinese. Wherever a major earthquake occurs, you have the action pattern of the specialty group that can access this food. Will all nations contribute? Yes. Now that they've seen what happened in Japan, it could happen in San Francisco, Los Angeles, or anywhere. A meteor can crash into any portion of the earth. There can be all kinds of catastrophes. So we would have a contribution center based on the carrying capacity of each nation. They will contribute whatever they produce. But once the nations merge together, they will contribute the necessary vitamins, medical equipment to handle the widest range of emergencies. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, I also want to ask you, what do you think people are really asking when they say, who makes the decision? It seems to me they're asking, how will I control my life in the conditions which I live under in this kind of world?
Do you control it today? When you get in this train, you control the noise level? Do you control the crowds where you have to stand, you can't sit? You don't control anything today. In the future, we will design more than adequate transportation because our aim is so you're not fatigued by the time you get to work. Otherwise, you can't perform as well. So instead of you sitting around the doctor's office for an hour till somebody calls you, there's also a newscast in the office. There's something. But we also speed up the way we treat people. We have other ways of checking out people before they visit the doctor with a chip system in the earrings or in a ring. So when you go to the hospital, all your records come forth because you have a microchip in your ring or your earrings or your necklace. So
a lot of people think, well, that sounds like George Orwell when you talk that way.
Well, don't you want your records come forth when you're brought into a hospital?
Well, you can understand that people don't trust in this system. They don't trust anybody.
There's a reason, because there's money involved. But in the other system, a resource-based economy, if they understand that the better off people are in physical health, the less burden to the nation. If you have to build nothing but hospitals because people get sick due to dirty air, filthy water, the expenditure, the operating characteristics of that country will be very low. Do you understand that? People are educated in school to show how and what efficiency means. Like, if I'm called upon as an efficiency expert and I design a half-round table so people can produce more in less time. In a money system, it's good for the owners of the factory. But it only becomes good in a resource-based economy that when I design access to materials for faster assembly, they go home earlier. They work less hours if the job is producing it. But if I design a machine to produce 3 times the product, there's no need to have people come to work. Or they go back to school and study something needed, which they probably want to do by the nature of the way they're raised in the future. They'll want to do some kind of public service to whatever extent they can. Older women like to take care of people in hospitals that are not quite their age, but they like to work with people and help them. There are many people that would volunteer to do work, but they don't have to volunteer, they'll be cared for, both health-wise, home, and in this access to things. So if you begin to deprive people of the necessities of life, your system won't work. So I'm saying the survey technique is the closest to getting people to understand that the more public service that's available, the less the cost of social operation. In the private enterprise system, somebody might earn $10 million a year or 15 or 20 million a year. That doesn't benefit the majority of people, it benefits a few. And to the extent that they can exploit other countries or cheap labor, they can live on much higher standard of living. They can buy their own island, build their own dock ships, their own yachts, and have their own mechanics on the island. They don't need to take it back to the States for service. So they can put the burden on the public, is what they do. Whenever you own your own island, you have your own mechanics and your own service, and you buy the best cooks in the world to serve your particular family, that's not bad for you, but it isn't good for the public. When we use the best cooks, they prepare food for the public, and they design how to make food tasty, not for a selected few at an exclusive restaurant. Exclusive means to exclude people. It isn't good. An exclusive club excludes people. Think about it. So you don't want that. You want people to eat wherever they want to eat and to go on vacations. If machines do most of the work, extend the vacation time. And you don't want to have to go to a beach where you have to pick up all the garbage. You want to go to a beach where the garbage is picked up automatically. So I would say automation is an easy system. Years ago, when I was a kid, men used to walk around with a stick with a nail on the end of it and pick up paper and put it in a basket. So I designed a round tank with nails sticking out, and you drag it over the land, it picks up all the paper. And then there's a comb that combs the paper off. Do you know what I mean? As the spikes come up, it combs paper, puts them in a container. Now, If you say, I hate that kind of work, then what do you recommend for doing away with it? There are people that are engineers that do that would like to do away with all dirty jobs. Because people keep asking me, who does the dirty work in the resource-based economy? If you do dirty work, you only work 2 hours a day, and you work 3 days a week. If that has to be done for some period of time, you change the incentives. You don't have to give more money, longer vacation, sailing, longer periods, you understand? But that's only until the technology is worked out. So during the transition, we were going to tell people that it may take 3 years to get to a point where you can distribute goods and services. The harder you work, the more effort you put out, the less time it'll take. And we will make that vividly clear in motion pictures, showing people how devotion to humanity can save energy. Will all people do the best they can? No. We don't need all people to do the best they can. It would take, from my estimates, at the time I worked it out, it took about 7,000 people to run everything on Earth. You don't need everybody's participation. You don't need everybody to be an engineer. All you need is maybe 200 production design engineers, and they can go to work, or 500, but you don't need 2 million. Do you understand that? So the guy said, what if you don't get enough engineers? We can always get enough engineers. There's no shortage. Do you have any other question?
Well, if you can talk a little more about what it is you think people really mean when they ask that question.
They really have a fear because the world they live in abuses them. And so they have contracts, and they have lawyers look at the contract to make sure there's no flaws in it that will cause them responsibilities that they don't want. In the future, the explanation of how the society works, how we use resources, restore the oceans, why we restore it, all of us are victims of a culture that's insufficient. But if we can't prove that to people through motion pictures and education, again, we don't have to prove it to everybody. Edison didn't have to prove the electric light to everybody. The more people that knew about it installed it right away. It was department stores that used electric lights first, the public last, because they didn't know what the hell the benefits were. They had gas lights in the streets, and men used to go down and light the gas lamp as they walked down. But the electric light took a little while to get in. But that's because the public was never updated. So in the future, we will update people on television and tell them what's new, what's available, why we're doing it this way. Always, the word used today is called transparency. The government will tell people what the new installations are for, why they're doing it, and do you have any suggestions? Send it in. And so, nobody in the future is on salary. Nobody lives in a bigger house than the average person. So you can't live a grand life in the society by non-conforming. When I say non-conforming, we don't need everybody to work, but the people we do need to work, there's more than enough. There's more than 7,000 people in the world that can work. So we don't have to worry about those things. Some people think, gee, there'd be millions of people. What if everybody wanted to be director of a program? Or what if everybody wants to be director of a plant today? So what are your qualifications? Where did you work before? What is your production rate as compared to other people? And if you have a wide presentation of your background, you get the job. So will everybody work in the future? Certainly not. There'll be a lot of people who do not work at all. But later on, the population will be maintained to correspond with the carrying capacity of the environment, rather than just support millions of people for no reason at all. Would not be workable in the future. It doesn't mean they would kill people. It means that the population will be better informed and not have as many children if we can increase the lifespan of people, say to 125 or 150 years. As we increase the lifespan, the childbirth rate would be decreased. If you don't do that, it won't work. Do you understand that? So it's not a question of following somebody's opinion. That the system we talk about is verifiable, measurable, and could be presented with statistical and mathematical data. And if the nation runs into some horrible catastrophe, some chemical agents from another planet destroy most of our farmland, then the research labs immediately will go on designing food structures. Food structures meaning arranging atoms and into molecular configurations that are edible. In other words, the research is determined by what's needed, not just a batch of research labs. If we suddenly detect a meteor coming toward the Earth, there's a responsible group, and that's people that work with telescopes and spectral analysis. And they say, the unit coming toward the Earth is 10 miles away. We have to design a rocket or a system to divert it from its path toward the Earth. That will not require selling people things. It would require that the people in charge of that handle that. The people in charge of bridges handle bridges. When they learn there's no more material left due to the media problem, then they'll have to substitute plastic or concrete or something else. People are not so fixed that they have to have a certain material. They can improvise many different things. I did want to tell you about that, the most important thing of that ornament that he made. You don't mind getting it? I'll tell you about it. Yes. This has a hard skin on the surface and on the bottom. But in between is foam. Did you know that? There's a foam-like material in there. And all branches that stick out, you don't need to make solid. You need foam and you need a hard surface. Nature had solved a lot of problems over the billions of years. The things that didn't work died out. It isn't that nature always made things better. They made millions and billions of mistakes. There are a lot of things in nature that didn't work, and it doesn't exist today. See, we're brought up to think that nature is constantly improving. Not necessarily. Birds that never fed its young died out as a species. Birds that didn't peck at the birds that were malformed, they pecked at them, killed them. And that bird, for whatever reason, the birds that didn't peck as much didn't kill unsurvivable species. You know what I'm talking about? Everybody thinks nature keeps moving upward. Not necessarily. If branches were solid like that, and there was a windstorm, it would blow the tree down. So the tree with foam, lighter foam, stronger outer skin. All trees have variations in the strength of the skin. It's not always the same. So if trees have a stronger skin, accidentally, genetic minor differences, and as a windstorm, this will survive, and this will produce the like materials. Do you understand that? It isn't that nature always works toward the best. It doesn't. It can't. I wanted you to know that there are a lot of palm trees here that have a foam core. It's relatively light and relatively very strong. It isn't the best shape. We can determine that today better, what the best shape is for this. And there are a lot of things that we may not know. We may not know how to control cancer. But there's a hell of a lot of research we directed in that area. The amount of research directed in the area is how much of a common threat is it? And the common threat to most people is what we work on, the common threat. But it doesn't mean that we negate other areas. We still do work in other areas. There'll be far more research done in the future, far more than any advanced civilization ever even attempted. Reason? Because we want people to survive. Not just survive, we want them to grow intellectually. We want their knowledge to be improved. And if computers can do more than people, people will work with computers and assign them certain tasks until the computers can assign themselves tasks. Now, a lot of people don't know that that's possible. It is possible to make machines that can improve themselves and solve problems. Once we attain that level, either some people will undergo modification, a genetic modification, so that they will understand the world they live in, whereas vast majority will not. They won't want that. And if it works for some people, it'll work. And if it doesn't work, others will try other systems. So not everything works all the time. The first flying machines crashed. Lots of them did. And a lot of people died. The moon voyage is the same story. In Russia, cosmonauts died of overheating in the re-entry vehicle. That told them how thick to make the walls of a re-entry vehicle. There is no other way to know. No one ever makes a mistake. They do what they know, and if it doesn't work, they have to improve what they know. And the only way to do that is to put man in a centrifuge and whirl him around and see when he conks out. That will tell you how fast you can travel. At what rate can you accelerate before man collapses? We don't know, so you have to find out. And so you find out either by putting sheep in an airplane and putting it through a 9G, or you put a weight there and put it through 9Gs, and the weight indicates 75 pounds, although it's only 25 pounds. You know that a human can't stand it. You don't need to kill animals in experiment. But if people are against killing animals for experiment, what do you offer? You want to try new drugs on people? Do you want to try new treatments on people? If you don't come up with something like the weight system is what you really want. You want to know how many pounds in a centrifuge is generated by a certain speed of rotation. You don't need to put a guy in a unit. You can say the guy would be increased by 300 pounds. He may survive or he may die. 400 pounds he won't survive. So you can use a weight equivalent, but you have to do a study on humans first. Do you understand that? To understand what they can stand. Okay. Any other areas?
Do you think people really are interested in being involved in decisions?
No. They're just interested in having access to the necessities of life. But the necessities of life will vary in the future. What people want today and what they want tomorrow will be very different. They'll be smarter in their selections.
Are people really interested in having control over their lives?
Not really. They just want access to things when they want it. In other words, if I have sailboats that are only available Wednesdays and the first of the month, then that will produce pain. They have to be available when people want it. And that's what your research labs are for, to meet those needs. I can assure you, if you don't meet those needs, the system won't work.
So what does it mean to you to control your own environment? Or to
I don't like to
the
control
environment?
anything. I'd rather teach people what to do. I don't like that. I mean, I have other things I prefer to do. So I'd rather teach people how to determine certain things if they don't know, and have other people that are creative teach how they do creative work. And if they don't know how they do it, psychologists would study conditions that are prevalent to creative people and try to induce that. If they're correct, it'll work. If they're not, it won't work. So survey is a great system for ascertaining the most suitable approach under a given set of conditions. We can never come up with an optimal approach to anything. Optimal means the end of the road. No one can design the best computer or the best cities or the best building methods or the best nutrition. That has to be studied. And once we get enough knowledge to be able to engage in that, we can ascertain those things. We cannot by, what do you think? What's your opinion? We can't do it that way. I'm sure you got enough stuff in there to answer that question.
Yeah, that's good.
This suggests that an airplane wing will have a structure on the outside in the future and foam on the inside. No ribs or bracing. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so displacement of the fuel tank and other things would be allowed. But that suggests a great deal of approaches from on conservation, lightness of weight and materials. You don't need a concrete building 5 inches thick. You need foam concrete in the middle. How do you do that? By working with chemists and say, chemists, what do you feel will cause concrete air bubbles in the concrete rapidly and is accessible? And I says, well, we don't have any such material. Then try looking for it. Taking concrete and injecting into it bicarbonate of soda, different materials that produce gas bubbles. Do you understand what I mean? So you can also try to find out how plants do it. And what the best shape for an air bubble. Is it round? Is it hexagonal? Where the air bubbles meet, they become flat. So if you've got 50 air bubbles surrounding an air bubble, they indent each other. And you can get more compact air bubbles in them. So we will design gases that produce the most efficient air bubbles. Do you know what I mean by that? Instead of random air bubbles in concrete. In other words, engineering molecular structures is a great thing. Right now, we can't grab them. They're too small. But with nanotechnology advances, that's why there'll be a great deal of research in nanotechnology or any other field that shows promise. That's not to detract from other researchers. We have so many research labs and so many people doing that because it's the most exciting field to work in, to be able to solve problems. And we always have a list of problems. And people will be, if they become exceptional problem solvers, they become teachers. Do you understand that? And they can make more students. If you make 500 students, not as efficient as you are, but much more efficient than they would have been. That's great. So the kids will feel better too, since they have real control over things. They're gaining real control. When you just boss people around, that's a psychological problem. It's not really healthy control. But control of giving people tools to think with is much more enriching than controlling people. But in a primitive society, all the king says if he doesn't like somebody, off with his head. And if they don't obey him, off with your head. You know what I mean? Those systems decrease the tribe, the loyalty, and the fear of people. And if you kill too many people, you build a lot of enemies. They might pick you off indirectly by poisoning your food. So the kings, I don't know if you noticed, used to have food tasters. Did you know that? That ate of the new dish. If the guy stood up and lived, the cook was promoted. If he died, the cook was executed, off with his head. So they learned in time how to control sabotage. You understand that? But they're not that bright. They don't understand that if you eventually meet human needs, you'll have no sabotage. To the extent that you don't have social dynamic equilibrium, you'll have problems. So natural law will intervene if you don't do the right thing. You know what I mean by natural law? You don't be mad to get mad at another guy for not doing something. His life would not be as pleasant if he can see the improvement. There are more people working on eye diseases, more people working on brain tumors, more people working on cancer and heart disease. When you see that, you have no reason to want to go back to the old trade barter system. And if they do go back, it means your system isn't working. That's the measure. How well the system works. Who decides whether the system is any good? How well the system works. I have no doubt that a resource-based economy will help more people. But I have a lot of doubt about the transition. I do think it will be tough, because I don't think people respond to language in uniform ways yet. But it seems that most people that come here seem to like, not just walk out saying, that was interesting, but seem to feel a sense of confidence. And they seem to feel that they've been given a great lift in many areas. And so I haven't had the opportunity to go ahead and speak to people that know nothing. And I won't approach them the same way I do this group. I might try, and if it doesn't work, I shift gears. And that's what you have to do. And so the teacher of the future, or the educator, if you wish to use those words, has to be a person that seeks out methodology, not insisting that people understand you. If you say, look here, why don't you think about what I'm talking about? God damn you, you're so narrow-minded you can't understand anything. You know, I can do that, but that won't work. It doesn't work. So I would say that when I say the better people are informed, I'm talking about the real world, not metaphysics, not religion. Religion has no methodology for accomplishing Christ-like behavior that I know of. I know very few people that can extract from religion to give all the world all the best that you have, and the best will come back to you. Not necessarily. You might be shot. I think Gandhi is a good example, Martin Luther King, of giving the world all the best that they had, and they were assassinated. But it says in the Bible, give all the world all the best that you have, and the best will come back to you. That's not true. So I don't like sections of the Bible, such as, we shall always have the poor amongst us. That makes no challenge. There will always be wars and rumors of wars. If I can't see beyond that, then my life has no meaning at all. If you can't see a possible solution to almost any problem, of course, there are many problems we'll encounter in the future that are new, but always challenges, which is part of being alive, solving problems. But when you just repeat the same thing over again, you're a carpenter, you use a handsaw over and over again, there's no challenge or color in your life. It flattens out. People need stimulus. And when they're in school in the future, the education system is a constant source of stimulus. Otherwise it won't work. So people are not asked to study certain things. We try to make films on exactly what that certain thing is and show it to people that, you know, I'd like to work in that area. Don't try to twist anybody's wrist, except in a national emergency. We need people to help out in that area until we develop other systems. So we don't have all the answers now. We never will have all the answers. And there'll always be a climb uphill, but it won't be as difficult once our language becomes modified so we can state the problem appropriately. And as I said before, there was a scientist that wrote a book on human behavior, and he said, don't ask people what they want. You'll only get feedback from the culture they come from. Tell them what they ought to want, and that's not easy to understand. Who are you to tell me what I ought to want? And that's taken as a negative by normal people today. But tell them what they ought to want means if you learn to fly an airplane and fire breaks out on the engine, you tell them how to fly at a certain angle so the fire doesn't burn toward the plane. That's telling them what they ought to want. And when you tell them about the Coriolis effect wearing out one side of the train, you tell them that the Earth's rotation does that, so you tilt the tracks and compensate for that. That's telling people what they ought to want, as I'm using the term. It is not me telling people what they ought to want. It's me finding out what people need and trying to show them without vitamin D or vitamin C, you're going to have certain problems, or lack of it. That's telling them what they ought to want. When you go to a doctor, he tells you what you ought to do. If you're getting rheumatic fever or difficult to move your arms, he tells you get a swimming pool and swim several laps every day. You can retard the development of arthritis. So isn't the doctor telling you what you ought to want if you want to get rid of the pain and not live on pills? That's why you seek out counselors and advisors, because they have more experience in things people ought to want. We don't know, because we don't have the time today to go to work every day and determine what we ought, or whether what we want is sensible or a product of culture, or movies, or books. So telling people what they ought to want is not a dictatorship. It's a dictate based upon studies as to what motivates people and what really enhances people's lives, rather than artificial beliefs. Knock wood, such as knock wood. I hope I have a much better weekend than I had last weekend. That doesn't make the weekend better. And when you tell a person, have a pleasant weekend, if you don't control that weekend, it's verbal behavior. It's a verbal wish. And if everybody, oh, thank you, that also is verbal behavior. So if you make the recreation place safer, with more amenities that will enhance people's lives, that's how you say have a nice weekend. By designing beds that are fireproof, designing buildings that are fireproof, that's how you say have a nice weekend in the future. But you don't use words like, well, have a wonderful life. Even that doesn't mean anything. There was a book by Ogden and Nash called The Meaning of Meanings. That was an early book on semantics. And if you wish to know more about communication, I will repeat that again. The Meaning of Meanings by Ogden and Nash. There's another book called Language and Thought and Action by Hayakawa. These are various books on semantics. Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski. The Tyranny of Words by Stuart Chase. And today there are probably many other updated books on semantics. I haven't read them all, but you might find some extensions in the book. Extensions mean something that will help you in your decision making. Rather than be self-centered decisions, it'll be more appropriate and realistic. I think you got enough bits there for that.
That's great, thanks.